Hello and welcome to Sierra-Cedar's first webinar in our new series, Jumpstart Your Cloud Journey with Sierra-Cedar and Oracle Analytics Cloud. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the webinar control panel. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, when you'll be able to submit any questions you may have using the chat panel located at the bottom. Today's presentation topic is Configure, Provision, and Migrate to Oracle Analytics Cloud Services. Our presenters are Jason Little, Vice President of our EPM and BI practice, and Bob Khalil, Director of our Infrastructure practice. Jason, please take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jason Little, and thanks for joining us today. We're looking forward to walking you through our 5-part webinar series. Again, my name is Jason Little, and Bob Khalil will also be joining us today. So we're excited about the webinar series we put together, really focused on different components of Oracle Analytics Cloud. The 5-part series will run over the next 4 weeks. We have 5 sessions in total, and we're going to be touching on various topics of the latest version of Oracle Analytics Cloud and all the various functionality available. In today's session, we're going to focus more specifically around how the services are set up and configured. We're going to share with you some examples of how you migrate Essbase applications to the Oracle Analytics Cloud. We're also going to get into a lot of details around creating a service and administrating the services, etc. So today will be a good introduction to the Oracle Analytics Cloud from a service administration and provisioning standpoint. Then we're going to move quickly into the second webinar session the following week, next Thursday, same time. You'll notice our series is same time, same day over the next 4 weeks. And in the second session, we're going to dive more into building and designing and administrating Essbase in the cloud. And we're really excited about this version of Essbase in particular. Essbase, really has, from an administration and design and calculation standpoint, not much different from your on-premise versions of Essbase, but we're excited to kind of go through how you can enable your classic Essbase functionality in the cloud. And we're going to touch on a lot of tips and tricks around creating Essbase databases. In the third session, we're going to focus on, for those of you out there that have Hyperion or Essbase applications, you'll be familiar with financial reports and web analysis and SmartView. In the third session, we're going to talk about how you can bring those reports over and leverage the OAC Essbase data source, but leverage the reporting capability of the Performance Reporting Cloud service. So we're excited about that topic as well, because we know a lot of Essbase and Hyperion clients out there use financial reports, so that'll be a very nice session to help you understand how that works. And then in the fourth session, we're really going to dive into Oracle Analytics Cloud in more detail, and we're going to talk about a lot of the functionality that integrates OAC with big data, predictive analytics, machine learning, day-by-day functionality within the Oracle Analytics Cloud, as well as your classic kind of BI functionality within the cloud. So we're excited about that session to kind of give folks a better understanding of how you can really take the Analytics Cloud solution and really deploy it a number of different ways, including integrating it with big data sources and using the Data Lakes version. And then our last session, we're really focused on, for those of you out there that are longtime OBIEE users and/or you've been using kind of the Oracle BI reporting tools on premise, we're going to talk specifically about how you can assess, migrating those specific reporting solutions to the Oracle Analytics Cloud, and talk about both Oracle BI and data visualization within the Analytics Cloud. So we're excited about this 5-part series. We're hoping this is very educational for folks and they're able to use the information, going forward. And we're also, certainly here to address your questions as you learn more about the Oracle Analytics Cloud over the next few weeks. So getting in today's agenda, we're going to talk specifically about the OAC product offerings and solution, as I mentioned, this is going to be a fairly technical session today around architecture, creating service, administration, etc. So quick overview of the Oracle Analytics Cloud. For those of you that are Essbase or OBIEE users out there, and or just, exploring the Oracle Analytics Cloud for the first time, you really got the functionality of Essbase as we've known to come to love over the years, as well as OBIEE. That functionality is very similar. You have your data management layer, where with the subscription, you get the Oracle database services. So you can set up your data catalog for Oracle BI. You can do the data preparation and all the data analysis across the organization. Of course, your standard business users and analysts can use the BI reporting capability that you've known as OBIEE. You can also have developers and data stewards create their own data models and set up data visualization models and connect those visualizations to different data sources. And the nice thing about the Analytics Cloud solution is it can grow into the Oracle Data Lake services as well, where you can integrate social data, data, as well as data outside of the enterprise, big data type solutions. So we'll talk about that as we go through the webinar series as well. Specific to Essbase, the nice thing about the OAC solution is Essbase is now, this is the version that integrates Essbase with Oracle BI. And we're really excited about that because, Essbase in this particular release is built for the cloud. This is the latest version of Essbase. A lot of times we refer to it as Essbase 12, but it has all the latest and greatest functionality of Essbase, but of course it runs in the cloud. So you can do your traditional data analysis cubes, where you can create your own standalone cubes, or you can migrate cubes from your on-premise Essbase version, and we're going to talk about that as we go through the session today. But the nice thing is this also integrates with BI now, so you can create cubes using data flows, data sync, data visualization. So there's a lot of functionality that really expands Essbase and allows you to introduce Essbase into the data catalog, but expands that well beyond what you could traditionally do with OBI. So we're excited about the future of Essbase and how you can do everything that people have come to love Essbase for over the years, but now you have this full Oracle Analytics solution built around it to extend it to other operational analytics, visualization type reporting needs. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Bob, and Bob's going to talk a little bit about the platform as a service.
Thanks, Jason, and hello, everyone. So with the Oracle Cloud offerings, we get a lot of questions on what is infrastructure as a service, what is platform as a service, or software as a service. What are the differences between those? Oracle and other cloud vendors, offer all three of these, and we're talking about OAC, which is platform as a service. They may help to understand the differences between these. Infrastructure as a service, if you think of your current, your data center where you actually have your hardware, that's what infrastructure as a service is. You're getting the basic, machine, the basic platform where anything can be built there. Oracle offers this service, as well as other vendors like Amazon AWS, for example, or Microsoft Azure. So those are good examples of, say, what infrastructure as a service is. You get a basic platform and you build from there. On the other end of that is software as a service, which many may be more familiar with. With the Oracle software service offerings, popular ones like the PBCS, the planning cloud service, EPRCS, some reporting cloud services. Those are subscription-based, software services. And what you're getting there, your application is already deployed. Everything is ready. You just want to actually configure your specific application. And other common uses of this, you'll see email, for example, is a pretty common software as a service. And even the GoToMeeting webinar we're using is a good example of a software as a service. So that leaves a platform as a service, which is what we have for OAC. And really, you've got this, so it kind of like it says in the slide here, it does abstract the infrastructure, the operating system, that's already in place. And what you will do is you'll deploy your application there. The main difference between platform as a service and software as a service is really the amount of control you have. You control what's deployed, when it's deployed. You get to control patching, you get to control backup. So you basically have a lot more control over the platform, over the applications than you would, say, with software as a service. We go to the next slide, Jason. When you're making your purchase for, or you're buying your subscription for Oracle Analytics Cloud, one of the early decisions you'll have to make, or as part of a prerequisite, is the sizing consideration. And the OAC is packaged by OCPU. And OCPUs are technically a Xenon level processor, and that will actually equal, it's hyper-threaded, so that will actually equal 2 vCPUs. So if you're thinking of that, it will show up as two virtual CPUs when you're looking at it. And the shapes that you pick will determine what you can deploy. You'll need at least one OCPU per instance. So if you're just looking to have one single instance, then one OCPU may be enough. And going through the shape list here, you'll see how they're offered. They're only offers in increments of 2. So we can buy, you can get one OCPU, 2 OCPUs, and each of those will come with a certain amount of memory or RAM available to them. At the bottom of that list are what they're called the high memory shapes. So if you have a high memory need for your specific application, you'll see that's basically double the amount of RAM. And these can be split up too. So for example, if you purchase 4 OCPUs, you could create 4 instances of 1 OCPU each, or 2 instances of 2 each, and so forth. So you have the flexibility to lay out your instances once you determine how many OCPUs are going to be in your purchase. And we'll get into this a little bit more detail as we get into the services itself, but these are the upfront, the kind of the basic considerations you'll make when you're deciding what to purchase with OAC. Okay, Jason. The release schedule for OAC, it's basically 2 major releases every year. Those are determined by Oracle. Of course, all of this is subject to change. Patches will come out every 1 to 2 months. You'll get notification on the patches. And as I mentioned before, since this is platform as a service, when the patches come out, you're not going to be tagged with, hey, there's going to be an outage at a certain time. You will determine when to apply the patches yourself. The data visualization desktop with OAC is also aligned with the cloud. So those releases, as those are updated, you'll get those updates as well. And then we have the current plan for the releases. The PS4 is actually scheduled now for April the 4th, version 4.2 later in April, and then the version 5 in June the 1st. And as always, these are subject to change as they go through their QA testing. Okay, Jason.
Yep, thanks, Bob. So just a couple other quick comments on the sizing and what you may have heard referred to as universal credits or universal usage. You really have the option to estimate what we call your monthly usage and product configuration. So we would work with you to determine, okay, what particular products within the OAC solution would you be looked to deploy, and what would the usage of those be? And we can then estimate. Of course, you would work with Oracle on the subscription itself. We would help you with the sizing of that subscription. And in terms of looking at your shape, size, and your product usage. And you have different options, as Bob was saying, with your shape size. You could go with 2 OCPUs, 4, 8, but you can do that under a standard type of edition deployment or scale it out to an enterprise edition. So there is functionality available as you were to scale out, for example, from a standard type deployment to an enterprise type deployment. And that monthly estimate or monthly usage is metered and monitored by Oracle each month. So each month you will look at your usage, and that's metered usage, and that then determines the subscription. Of course, your product usage and also determines the cost of that monthly subscription. So as Bob mentioned, there is a new version coming out, Oracle Analytics 5, in the future as well, that we can talk more about as we go through the sessions. Wanted to make a couple quick points about Essbase version 12. It is a new architecture for the cloud. So Essbase was reimaged, redesigned here in release 12 for the cloud. Couple little differences you may or may not be aware of, but security and filter definitions are now stored in a relational database, Oracle's database services. You have the ability to use Oracle Data Sync. That's a solution that's coming that I think more and more on-premise customers may start to look at in the future, where you can do secure data pushes from on-premise to the cloud. And the nice thing about this new architecture in Essbase is you can administrate everything in the cloud. So for those of you that are familiar with Essbase administration services, that is the on-premise way of kind of administrating your Essbase server. You can basically, that is replaced and goes away, and you now have a new database management outline editor tools to administrate the application, and I'm going to show you some of that as we go through the session today. You also have the ability to do everything with Excel administration. I'm going to show you a little example of that today as well. We're going to talk through an example of migrating a cube to the cloud, as well as to the Excel workbook application. So you really can administrate the application 100% in Excel with this new release. But you can also administrate it the old classic Essbase administration approach with the cloud administration and data management tools as well. So one of the key Essbase server enhancements that we're going to talk a lot about in the next webinar next Thursday is some of the server enhancements behind the scenes to the Essbase engine. We refer to it as the hybrid engine. By default now, when you deploy an Essbase cube in OAC, you can take advantage of the benefits of BSO and ASO automatically by default. We call it default hybrid. And we'll talk more about that in the next session. We'll also talk about the drill through reporting capability and some of the ability to manage the data within Essbase. So a quick kind of comparison of Essbase versus on-premise, Essbase in the cloud versus on-premise. One of the kind of key differences up front is that hybrid model gives you more flexibility to design your cubes. Your filters are now stored in a database instead of a file. The administration of those filters is very similar, but you also have the Essbase DR support if you go with the enterprise version. In addition, behind the scenes, you get the benefits of Exalytics. So you may be familiar with that if there's anyone on the line that runs Essbase on the Exalytics or the engineered hardware. Well, behind the scenes, this is running on the engineered hardware, so you automatically get the benefit of that. Also, there's a full kind of REST API available for doing custom development within the application. So some really cool things here in terms of the direction of Essbase that we're excited about, that really give customers and business more flexibility to deploy Essbase and to manage Essbase, but also continue to give IT organizations the tools they need to administrate Essbase. And then lastly, of course, the flexibility you'll get by now Essbase being integrated with sandboxing and Oracle BI and data visualization really opens up the solutions to a larger audience. So at this point, Bob, I'll turn it back to you to cover the architecture in more detail.
Great, thanks, Jason. So yeah, the next section we're going to cover the architecture of OAC, basically the components that are required, what those components do and how they work together. Then we'll go through setting up a service and finish off with my section with some basic administration tasks. So essentially there are three components to OAC. All three are required, and these are always going to be bundled together with your subscription. But you'll need a cloud storage. I'm calling it OCS, and that's going to be, your backups are stored there, logs, other storage pieces like property files, shell scripts, Linux shell scripts and things of that nature. That's your cloud storage piece. Think of it as your drive. It's your partition or your mount point. The second required piece is the database. This is going to be, like Jason said, an Oracle database, and it's required whether you're doing an Essbase or a BI analytics instance. It stores the schemas that are used, and they're going to be created automatically for you by the RCU. We'll take a look at the database creation itself. It's fairly straightforward, but every OAC domain is going to require at least one database. Again, that'll be bundled with it as well. And of course, the target or the goal of all of this, once we have those two components in place, is to actually get an analytics instance right. And the main choice there when you go to deploy your analytics instance is it going to be an Essbase instance, or is it going to be an OBI EE data visualization type instance? When we talked a little, I mentioned earlier that some of these are all required pieces, and certainly that storage and database are required. You have to have at least one of each of these. But one important, I think, takeaway here is that the storage container and the database can support multiple instances. So if you have 4 instances, you really just need the one storage container. You just need the one database. In the example I'm showing here, I've got an Essbase Analytics and a BI Analytics instance, using the same storage and database. Things I would consider here when architecting this and laying this out would be, if I'm going to have a production and a development or a non-production environment, I would probably go with a separate storage container for those. And the same with the database, and that will help you when it's time for doing backups and patches. It will, you won't have to have service interruptions in production when you're doing those kinds of things in the development environment. So those are the kind of things I would take into consideration. But like I said, at the bare minimum, you have to have at least one of each of these. So once you purchase your subscription, you've gotten the email from Oracle, and you've logged in and named your domain. Those are the first steps. You'll do all of that from the initial setup. The service itself is created. Now you can log in. It's time to start creating the new service. And like I mentioned before, those 3 components are what's needed. So you're going to create those pretty much in the same order that I talked about. The first thing you'll want to do is create your container, your storage container. We'll look at that in just a second, the actual steps in that. It's pretty straightforward. Then we're going to create the database. That's going to hold all those schemas, and we'll select the properties and parameters that are needed for that database. And then lastly, the goal or end target here is our analytics instance. And I said before, it's either Essbase or BI Dev. You can't have both, so you'll have one or the other. It's either going to be an Essbase instance or a BI data visualization type instance. And as I mentioned earlier, you can have multiple instances sharing a database. You can have, say, a production and a development database, and those can support multiple instances, and the same with the containers as well. The container is the first piece, and like I said, it's really very simple. There's simply just one screen to show when you go to create your container. You're from your dashboard page, which I'll hop onto the cloud here in just a second and show that. But the only parameters here are going to be the name, your storage, and the one that is the only one that is required is the name of the container. Your storage class is standard, or archive is the other one. In most cases, there's really no reason not to use standard. So that's the default. I would just leave it at standard. I've expanded the advanced here so we can see it. That's all that does is allow you to enable or disable encryption. So encryption is disabled by default, and this is encryption for the actual drive or the file storage system itself. Those are only selections you need to make, and from there you actually create your container. One important note here, and you'll see this when you created that format, you will need that later. That's the URL format. You can get that from a couple places, but you'll see basically your domain name is the distinguishing piece here in the container. So that's how you know where your container is or how you'll access that later. Once a container is created, I know this is a little bit small, but I'm just showing an example from ours. From the actual dashboard, you can actually look at the containers themselves. Again, you can have multiple containers. Each container, once you pulled it up, like I've done here to show the detail, you have a list of the actual file system objects that are saved there. If you've done some backups, for example, this is where your backups will be saved. If you wanted to pull a log file up or down for further review, you can do that from here as well. If you look down at the bottom to the right there, those actions are just for that. You can either upload a large file or download these for further use. If you're going to do a migration, this is another way. Those bar files we're looking at now, or key files used in the migration, for example, of a BI system. So that's really what's going to contain. It's going to show you what's exactly stored there. A little later on, we'll look at the SSH access. You can actually get in and browse that file system as well. But the actual dashboard will give you a good list of what's there, when it was modified, and the actual size of the object that's in the container. The second step, and probably one that first starts to get a little more complicated, is creating a database, right? So we have to actually create a database, and we can actually do that from within the cloud. Let me switch over. So once you've gone to the database, I just went basically from the dashboard. I went under services. I went to the database. I'm going to do create a new instance. We'll start back on the instance screen. The items with an asterisk are going to be required. And with all of these, there's going to be a little bit of wizardsy steps that we're going to walk through. The first, we're going to define our instance for our database. We have to give it a name. And there's some restrictions here, how long it can be, which characters can or are not allowed. Now, obviously, something simple here, you may want to indicate whether it's production, non-production. So we can, maybe say my BI, for example. You can give it a description if you want to help users understand what that's for. The email notification is going to default to the account owner. The region that you create in, there's only 2 choices right now. This is where you would just pick the one closest to your geographical location. Any tags, they're not required, so generally you won't need those as well. The service level is going to default to the only one, what you've purchased. You see the virtual image is grayed out. That's more of an infrastructure side. We're going to leave that on Oracle Database Cloud Service. The software release, you can go with different versions. You still could deploy 11G, for example. There's still a couple of issues with 12C Release 2. I would recommend, at least for now, staying with 12C Release 1, which, as you know, is also the default. Next is Software Edition, and the Standard Edition is all that's required. You'll see Enterprise is grayed out for me there. We can't select that. So really, Standard Edition is fine. And then the database type. In our case, unless you purchase replication, a single instance is all we're going to need. Again, this is a fairly small relational requirement. It's really just to store those schemas. The next screen is going to fill in some additional details, and some of these are pretty critical. Obviously, the database name itself, it's going to default to the standard Oracle name of ORCL. And because this is 12, we get a PDB name. This is very similar to the SID you may have used with other Oracle releases. These can be changed. Very critical one here. This is our sys password and system password. So if we're going to access that database later, and you may have to for during your backup or patching process, or maybe there's a script you need to run against your database, want to make sure you hang on to this particular password. That's going to be for sys or system access. The defaults are fine for the storage. This will actually grow if needed. And we talked about OCPUs earlier. Yes, the database itself does require an OCPU. So even if I purchase one OCPU and I'm going to use that for analytics, I've still got to have another one for my database. So that's going to be bundled by Oracle. You don't have to worry about, hey, do I need to buy 1 or 2 for the day? They're going to bundle that for you, but you will need to pick a shape for your database, just like you would for your analytics instance. The SSH key, I'm going to show that a little more later, but that's going to generate a private public key set. If you're the type that likes to log in directly to the Linux server itself, you'll need that public and private key to use. And I'll show you how to use that a little bit later. The backup destination, the default is going to be just fine, local and cloud. The container, and this is already defaulted to me to the one that I created earlier. Username, this will be the user that's that is used to create and own the database. It can be anything you need it here. If you had not created a cloud storage container, and you'll see this in analytics as well, because you can create multiple containers, I can choose to create a new container here. So if I hadn't created one already, or I wanted to create a new one, I could just leave that as is. And again, it's going to give you a default for the estimated monthly storage. In general, you're getting about 1 terabyte of storage with your subscription, so the defaults are probably, again, okay here. The last thing before we go to the create section here is you could also have if you had a backup from an existing database, you could use that to initialize it. You would hit yes and then go through the steps to actually create that database. I'm not going to obviously be able to go through the next step because that would, in fact, create the database, which we are not going to do. Let me go back up to where we were. So creating database, pretty straightforward. The key things to keep in mind, what are you going to name the database? Your name of your service, the name or SID, and that sys or sysadmin password. Defaults are pretty standard for the rest of that. And you have an opportunity to create that public and private key if you wish to use SSH access at some point. It will create the key for you, or if you have keys you want to use, you can also upload those as well. Once those are created, the actual dashboard where I was before, we can kind of get a review of those. In our particular case, in this example, I've got 2 databases that were created, one for BI, one for Essbase itself. The summary at the top tells you what you're using here. So I think it's pretty good information. How many instances are running, how many OCPUs are consuming, and memory, and the actual storage itself. From here, I can get access to the console. I can launch Enterprise Manager to monitor the database. I can I can do patches from here if I wanted to patch the database, and I get notifications. So in this particular screenshot, we don't have any pending patches, but there will be a note right by your database name. Hey, there's at least one patch available, or 2 patches, or patches are pending. I can create some access rules, which I'll get into that a little more, I think, on the analytics side. And those are like firewall rules. I'm going to open and close ports to allow traffic in and out. But the most important thing you would probably do from this particular screen outside of the patching is stop, start, or restart your database. So a good way to monitor the database, these are links here, and they'll take you directly to the database information where you can do additional monitoring. Next step then would be we create an analytics instance. So we've got our container already created, we have a database created, and now we're going to create the actual analytics instance. A couple, again, very similar wizard. We'll do the instance information, then we'll go through the details, and then we'll confirm and actually create the instance. We're going to give it a name, the description again as well. Same with the notification email. You can use the same keys you had before, or generate new keys, or upload your own keys. Again, we're going to pick that region. And for IP network, if you had a preference, in most cases, it's going to be fine to leave that at the default. The detailed screens on the analytics are a little bit different. Starting at the top, the identity management. Most people are going to use IDCS. That's the identity management that comes with it. You're basically using the WebLogic, the built-in identity controller. So you would be able to create users right here in the service. That's what that is for. That's where you actually be able to create and add users. To the right here, a service administrator. It's going to default to the name admin, but you can rename that. So if you wanted to have, if you had, say, a BI instance and an Essbase instance, you could have an S admin and a BI admin. You certainly can change that. You'll give it a password and confirm it. And then down here are the options. And this is where I mentioned you'll be able to select whether you want to do a BI instance or an Essbase instance. For further down, your sizing, we talked about earlier this, where you can actually pick this number of those CPUs you're going to dedicate to this particular instance. The actual storage, again, the default's going to be fine because these are going to automatically grow if needed. IP is no problem here. The cloud information, storage information is the stuff I was talking about for the URL I mentioned. That's where we would get that information from. And then cloud username and password. Prior versions, you could not use an email address as a username, but that has been corrected with the latest releases. So either a user with an email address, username, or even just a default username like admin could also be created here. The last thing you'll have to choose is which database. If you've created multiple databases, if you only have one, it'll be in your drop down here, which database you're going to assign for this particular analytics instance. And if you want to create a prefix for the schema. So, a lot of times you'll do that to indicate whether it's production or development. In this case, I've used PRD. And there's my database administrator and username. That's the information I would have had before when I was creating that particular instance. So once you've created that, you've created the container, you've created the database, you've created the instance, you're going to go ahead and start it. It will take about 45 minutes for the creation process to occur, and then everything should be up and running. And from there, you'll be able to access your instance. Once the instance is up and running, again, we're looking still at the service side of this, so we'll talk about some basic administration. I've talked about this dashboard quite a bit. The actual dashboard is your main login as a service administrator. This is not where users will access. This is only for the administration type user. These are specific users that you can create and be assigned specific roles. Some users can be delegated just to do the database work, some for the storage work, and some with the access to analytics only. So you get to decide. When you create a user, you can assign administrator roles, you can copy your roles over, or give them just specific access to the pieces that you want them to have. The summary screen, very helpful. I'm looking at the analytics. You can have a summary screen like I showed before for the container. You can a summary screen for the database and a summary screen for the actual analytics itself. This tells you how many instances you have running, what's the access, what is dedicated there for CPUs, memory, and storage, what IPs are available. And I mentioned before about patches, and that's why I wanted to show this screen. This tells me at a glance, hey, I've got a patch that I could apply here. And to do that, I would simply drill into the instance and apply the patch. I'll show you that in the next step here. But if there is a patch available, you'll get that notification as well. I can also stop and start an instance from here as well. Of course, if I need to stop or start, I can do that right here from the summary screen. Let's look at that detail. And this next screen, I've drilled into this BI prod instance. Same control, I could still stop or start or scale down. And I want to talk about that real briefly. So with scaling up and scaling down, that's actually adding or taking away resources. So, just a good example, if I have a production and a development instance, and I'm not using development, and I know I've got some increased need in production, I could conceivably scale down my development instance, shut it down. And if I shut it down, you'll see on that summary screen, now I have one OCPU available. I can actually scale up my production instance. It is an outage, but I can actually assign that other CPU. So I can move my resources between instances. So if I don't need dev, and I know I need some extra resources in production, I can shut down dev and scale up prod. So now I'll run prod, for the time being with two OCPUs where, and dev itself is offline. I can apply the patches here. We talked about it. There's a patch. In this case, I have two patches available. I'll get to see other information like the last backup. I can do my backups from here, create my backup. I'll see my databases that are assigned. I can get my keys if I didn't have them already for the SSH access. I can go to access rules, which I'm going to show a screen on that in a second here because I think those are kind of critical. That's your firewall rules as well. And again, I can go directly to the application, to the URL, which is going to be using the IP address. So when these instances are created, they're assigned a public IP address. You can certainly use DNS to make that a more user-friendly name. From a security and SSL point of view, this is SSL, but by default, you'll get a self-generated certificate. So what that means is you'll get all these warnings that they don't recognize your certificate. So you may, at that point, you will want to use your SSH access and go in and maybe replace that self-generated certificate with one of your own or a third-party cert so that you no longer get those warnings as well. You will get a self-generated one by default, though. I mentioned access rules earlier, and those are going to be kind of important because that's how you're going to actually, let parts talk to each other. Think of these as like firewall rules, and you can create new rules and use the existing rules. If you look to the right here, there's some default and system rules. Those are required. Those are going to be created for you already and give you a chance to kind of see what they should look like. But in the description, these will tell you what they're doing here. That's open port 80 for internet access, obviously, to the BI server. This SSH port 22 by default is your SSH access, and these are system and default. So these are created and provided to you automatically. And then further down, you'll see I've actually created a rule here where I was going to grant, I think, Essbase access back to another database or to another service. So I've just created a rule. You'll choose the source. You choose the destination. You can use a port or a range of ports here in the protocol. Pretty straightforward. Create the rule and then simply use the menu to stop or start or disable or enable the rule or delete the rule if you no longer need it. And lastly, on the administration, I know it's been kind of quick, but some of the other basic administration tasks, we talked about patching. One quick note on the patching, there's a readiness check. So before you patch, if you're planning on doing patching, you set a maintenance time, run that readiness check. It'll let you know if there's any issues that need to be addressed before you go down and start the actual patching. The patching by default will do a backup before anything else happens, so you do get some protection there. So the first step when you actually run the patch, the system's going to do a backup, and it's going to take everything offline. So these do require a service outage, so heads up, you want to let your users know before you do patching, there's going to be some downtime depending when I'm going to do the patch. We talked about scaling up and down. That does free those resources where you saw that summary screen where all 4 of those were available or 0 were available. If I shut one of my instances down, you would see 1 OCPU is available, and I can scale that into another instance. So I just go back to that instance screen, actually use that resource in another instance while the other one is offline. I'm just briefly here going to talk about SSH before I hand it back over to Jason. You can use SSH. You just need a client like PuTTY or a MOBA X window, something of that nature. You're just going to, I've actually got an example here. This will be sent to you, so you'll have actual syntax. You'll need that private key that we talked about earlier and your actual IP address. But once you get in, you can sudo to the Oracle user, and then from there, do things like I said, examine the logs. You can look at some of the shell scripts, go through the import-export process, or just interact directly with those file system objects. So because it's platform as a service, you do have this extra access and more control over your actual environment. And Jason, I think you were going to take it from the migration piece.
Yep, thanks, Bob. So moving along here, our next, before we wrap up here, we're going to kind of dive into some specific migration topics and talk about what some options are to move on-premise Essbase to OAC. And then, of course, you saw our last webinar series is dedicated to looking at moving your OBIEE reporting to OAC. So there's a couple different options specific to Essbase. I'm going to first start by talking about what we call the lifecycle management option. And this particular option allows you to basically export your on-premise cubes and import them directly into the cloud. There is a couple of prerequisites for this particular option. You do have to log into Essbase Administration Services. So you'll see here, this is your, your traditional Essbase server administration, where you administrate your Essbase servers and your applications and databases. You do have to go in here and convert the cube to Unicode mode, and basically just save that, and then you can run the export of that particular cube using the LCM process. So to export an on-premise application with Essbase LCM utility, the prerequisites are you have to have the Essbase LCM utility installed and downloaded. You can download it right from the cloud. You do have to run it against Essbase version 11.124 or above. Now, at Sierra-Cedar, we do have the option to assist you in this. So if you're on an older version of Essbase, we have the ability to kind of help you temporarily upgrade to 11.124 and then run this export utility as well. So we can assist you in that process if you're not on 11.124. You have to have Java 8 and the Java development kit installed. And then from there, you've got a little sample script here. You basically just open up a command prompt and enter the command to export the application using the following commands. Pretty simple process. You just log in, change your directory to the Essbase LCM utility directory, and then you run this Essbase LCM.bat export, and you put in your properties, your server name, username, password, application, file, path, etc. And then that'll generate the files required to import that cube to the cloud. So you then, you can create an application shell in the cloud prior to importing it if you wanted to set some application database properties. But then you import those files from the export using what's called the command line interface. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the command line interface, it's a new automation and command line tool that comes with cloud. And prerequisites here, you have to have the command line interface utility installed and the Java development kit 8. And very similar process here, but here we're going to open up a command prompt, and then here's again a sample script to import the application from the zip file that's created. So you basically go to the command prompt, change directory to CLI, and then you run the command line interface commands to import that cube. Of course, you can override or merge or whatnot depending on how you exported it and whether you created a shell. You can then just log right into the cloud and view the application from within the cloud. So I'm going to jump over here real quick, and now I'm logged into the cloud, and you'll see I'm in a Oracle Analytics Cloud Essbase instance. So very similar type of topics and language for those of you that are familiar with Essbase administration. But here in the main screen, you've got all your applications and databases, so I can look at all my ASO, BSO, or default hybrid cubes here. You do have one database per application, and you can click over here on actions, and you can do your typical start, stop the application or database, start, stop the application or database at the database level. So kind of standard Essbase administration functionality here, working with the cubes. Over here on the right, you have your functionality for managing your outline, your jobs, your scripts, your administration, your security, etc. So when you use the Essbase LCM utility, it does migrate your users and security filters for you. So that's a nice feature. If you go into security at the server level, here you'll see here's all my users, and then I could go in and create a new user or look at filters specific to an application. So I can migrate those users over with the LCM utility. The other option using the workbook does not migrate your security filters, but they're really easy to set up. So if I take an example here of a particular cube, I'll look at this particular one. We'll look at the spin plan, which is your a typical financial reporting application. If I look at the security on that one, you'll see it brings me into filters, and this replaces Essbase administration services. So there is a new kind of interface to learn about how you create your filters, but very similar process to what you've been used to in the past with managing Essbase filters. Of course, you can go in and on an administration level for this particular application, you can look at the properties and the settings of that particular application, any variables, any location aliases, your logs. You can look at all your logs right here. You can also view the logs right from the server level. As Bob was saying earlier, you can use an SSH session to go right out to the server and view the logs as well, or you can view the logs from here within the Essbase Analytics administration interface. Of course, you can see all your dimensions. Right now, this is we're looking at a block storage outline. You can see the dimensions that were migrated. Of course, you can drill into them. In the current version, it's showing your dimensions in the cloud here in this kind of table format. There is a patch or a release coming out that's going to allow you to view your hierarchies and dimensions via an outline editor here within the cloud as well. Right now, it's a flat list, but that's going to be addressed in the next version. But once you migrate the cube, you can go in here, you can look at all your dimensions members, you can look at all the properties of those members. You can also migrate over all your scripts. So all your calculation scripts would come over as part of that migration. And then from within the cloud interface itself, in the next webinar is where we're going to really dive into how you create scripts and jobs and how you manage your dimensions, create new cubes, and or modify existing cubes. And we're going to go through some examples of creating dimensions and updating dimensions, et cetera. So we're excited about kind of diving into the next level of detail in our next webinar series around getting into those details of how you manage the dimensions as well as update those dimensions going forward. So that's just a quick walkthrough of the LCM utility and kind of how you can quickly get all your cubes up in the cloud. Notice there's no restriction on the number of cubes here. If you do migrate the cubes one by one, but you can bring over there's no limitation on the number of cubes you have set up here. It's just a matter of sizing your shape size, as Bob and I have been discussing, to support the right number of processors depending on the size of your cubes and how many concurrent cubes you run at one time. That would lead us down the path of making some recommendations on that shape size and how many resources you would need. But the nice thing about Essbase, and we've had the opportunity to work with Duke University health system on their migration to the cloud, and the performance has been outstanding of those cubes in the cloud. Remember, behind the scenes, it is an engineered system, so you are getting the advantage of that, Oracle's engineered systems running behind the scenes for performance. So Exalytics, performance levels are kind of out of the box. And then, of course, you get, all the functionality around hybrid, default hybrid, and ASO that you would come to expect with Essbase. So we're going to dive into those topics as well in the next webinar. So back to my my presentation. The next option to migrate is using the Cube Designer application workbook method. So kind of a similar process. You have to export the on-premise application, again, using the DBX tool export utility. And there are some prerequisites here. You have to download that utility and install it. You have to be on version 11.124 again and have the Java runtime environment updated. And then here's just a sample script again of what that process looks like. You just go to the command line again and change directories to that bin directory, and then you run that export.bat file, and that will export the process, exit, and generates the files for you. Now, one thing that's different about this particular migration option versus the LCM is this one does not bring your security filters over. So this, if you did go with this approach, you can bring your users and your security filters over through a MAXL script, and we can kind of talk about that in a little more detail in the next webinar. But you do have the ability to manually bring over your users and security filters as well. This particular migration approach does not take those filters. Notice data is optional. You can bring your data with it, but that really depends on the size of your cube. If it's a smaller cube, let's say less than 2 gig, where you only have 1 page file, you're typically okay to bring that over with the data. But if it's a very large cube with 20+ page files and 60 gig of data or something like that, we'll want to talk to you about kind of some alternative ways of bringing the data over to the cloud. So within Essbase, again, we can create an application shell, and then we basically import that cube, and it generates an Excel file for us with that particular application. And then you can go view that application in the cloud once you run the script. So back here to Excel, I went ahead and ran the workbook migration approach, and I'm in a sample workbook now. So across the bottom, you'll see it brought over everything related to that cube. And you can now do all administration within Excel. So the nice thing about this particular version is I can 100% now administrate the cube here from within Excel if it's a small cube. Of course, we'll want to talk about how large your cubes are, because you can store your data here within a tab across the bottom as well. You have the ability to store all your dimensions, your data, your calculations, etc. Everything is self-contained here within an Excel file, which I think will work great for managing your dimensions and metadata. So if you want a real simple process to manage your dimensions and your cube settings, you can do that from right here within Excel, and you don't even need to log into the cloud. Of course, as an administrator, you would need to look at log files and things like that. So there still would be some, reason to go kind of back and forth, as Bob was talking about, if you're a server administrator or an instance administrator, or even, managing and administrating the OAC application itself, as Bob was talking to. So back to Excel, the nice thing is here is when you bring this cube over, it automatically creates, whatever cube settings were that you had on premise. So, it brings over your alias tables, it brings over all your dimensions, so your count dimension, your period, your scenario, your years, all your dimensions, your entity dimension. And notice over here on the right, you have a Essbase Cloud Cube Designer interface. So Cube Designer, this ribbon here within Excel, notice it sits side by side Smart View. You do have to install Cube Designer. That's what allows you to administrate your Essbase Cube 100% from within Excel here. You have a formula editor, you have a view hierarchy. So right now I'm looking at the parent-child relationship of my entity dimension. If I want to view that in hierarchy form, I can just click View Hierarchy, and then you can view it in the, your traditional kind of Essbase format where you drill up and down your hierarchy, etc. But I can make changes to these hierarchies right here on the fly in Excel and update that and load that right to the cloud. So you're able to actually administrate your dimensions from right here as well, make changes and reload it to the cloud. You also have all of your cube settings over here. So you have your settings, whether it's a block storage. Remember, by default, it's aggregate. It uses the hybrid mode by default. So we'll talk more about that in the next session. But you have all your standard properties here of setting aggregate missing values, create blocks on equation, typical, dimension build properties and consolidation properties and expense reporting. Do I want comments? Is it going to be a formula, et cetera? And then, of course, you have your data and your calculation scripts here as well. So it brings everything, here within the Excel workbook. So here you'll see it creates a different tab for each one of your calculation scripts. So here's a typical calculation script. It just migrated it right from on-premise to the cloud, and same syntax that you had on-premise. So the nice thing about the workbook option is it's really an easier way to administrate the Essbase cube. In particular, if you have smaller cubes and you're just maintaining your dimensions manually, which a lot of clients do that because they don't have a lot of changes. And if they have a new account or a new entity, they just go in and add that, through Essbase administration services and save it and restructure the cube, you're done. Well, you can do all that through Excel now. So real easy way to kind of maintain your dimensions as well as build new cubes, which we're going to talk about that in the next webinar session. So that's a quick kind of high-level walkthrough of the two options to migrate to your cubes. And that brings us to the end of our webinar today. We do want to open it up for questions. And I do want to make a couple quick comments. We do have some supplemental information and migration considerations for you included in the presentation today. And we will put that in a PDF document for everyone and send it out to you in follow-up, so you'll have access to the PDF. But we do have down below here, we do have some supplemental information that I encourage everyone to take a look at, specific to migration considerations. We'd love to have follow-up conversation with you about some of these specific topics and Sierra-Cedar services that we provide to help you through the migration and what to think about in that migration. And then we also included a summary of OAC here and the broader functionality of integrating Oracle Analytics Cloud and what's provided with data visualization, BI, extended analytics with the predictive analytics and day by day, et cetera. So there's some additional information here you can reference and follow up. So back to kind of closing out and opening up for questions. We appreciate everyone joining today. And I just want to emphasize one last time, please join us for our next round of webinar next Thursday. We're really going to dive into more details on creating and managing Essbase databases in the cloud. And then, of course, some good topics coming up all the way through our last session around being able to move your OBI-EE to reporting to the cloud. So at this point, Michelle, do we have any questions?
Thank you. We now invite you to submit your questions in the chat window at the bottom of the webinar control panel. First question, you mentioned OAC was a platform as a service offering. Does that give administrators the ability to manage the service at the Linux command line? What command line admin options would be available?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that question. Bob, can you jump in and kind of talk about that? That's a good question. And the nice thing about the platform as a service is it gives you that control.
Yeah, that's right, Jason. Yeah, we did kind of allude to that. That's the SSH access that I talked about. So when you're creating your service, you will have the opportunity to either generate a private and public key pair or use one of your own. You'll need that, and then you'll need some sort of utility, to connect to the Linux server directly, like PuTTY or MOBA Xterm or some similar utility. And then from there, you can simply SSH right into the VM for either the database or the VM for analytics. And once there, you can sudo. You already have the rights to sudo as the Oracle user to give you some elevated privileges. And at that point, it's up to you what you want to do. Sometimes you may need to run a script. Sometimes you may want to look at review a log or download a log or edit a log or actually look at any of the other file system objects. Good question. Thank you.
Next question, is Essbase hybrid aggregation mode automatically enabled? What if you had an Essbase calculation script that referenced upper level numbers? How does default hybrid aggregation change?
Yeah, good question. That's a really good detailed question that we're going to talk about more in our next webinar. So that's a good segue into our session next Thursday. But at a high level, yes, it is default hybrid. That's when you bring your cubes over into the cloud, by default, they're hybrid. And they want to take advantage of all upper level members using the aggregate storage technology or the aggregation mode for upper level members. So by default, that's the out of the box approach. Now, if you do have a classic Essbase application where you have a couch script where you're storing data and referencing data cross-dimensionally at upper levels, then you can then flag that cube as a classic block storage cube, and basically the hybrid mode would be disabled. You wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. So good question. And again, we'll talk more about that in next Thursday.
Next question, can you increase and decrease the shape sizes for CPU and memory based on resource needs? Can you change the shape size for different environments, i.e. prod versus UAT versus dev?
Yeah, good question. Bob touched on that a couple of different times earlier at a high level. Bob, maybe you could jump in and kind of emphasize again the flexibility you have to change those shape sizes. And one of the things that I find very beneficial to kind of sizing OAC is you can change your shape size, and you can allocate more resources to a production environment versus a development environment, and you can move resources around. But go ahead, Bob.
That's great, Jason. That's a good question as well. It's just a matter of reallocating the resources. If you're looking at the dashboard, for example, where I showed the dashboard earlier, if you're a service administrator and you go in and you shut down one of your environments, you will see in the summary now that you have an extra CPU available, or two, or depending whatever you had in that instance. When you stop an instance, or scaling down an instance, you can take it down from 2 to 1, or if I just shut it down, I'll actually free all of those resources up. So you'll essentially have free resources at that point in time. And then you could do the same thing. You go to the, so like an example I think that was mentioned, you can go to the production instance and scale that back up, where if I had 2 and now I've got 2 free, I can simply go to 4 in prod while my other environment is offline. So a lot of flexibility among those resources. So, and again, no limit to how many you can create. It's a limit to how many you can run based on your subscription, but you can create multiple instances, leave them shut down till needed, and as long as you've got a free resource, and you'll see that in your summary, you can reallocate that to any other instance. It's the process is called scaling up and scaling down.
Okay. Thanks, Bob.
Great. I believe we've covered all of our questions. Jason and Bob, is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap up today?
No, not at this point. We appreciate everyone joining today again, and look forward to next Thursday.
Great. We hope to meet with you again next Thursday. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.